Christmas Day, 1914. My dear sister Janet, it is 2 o'clock in the morning, and most of our men are asleep in their dugouts. Yet I could not sleep myself before writing to you of the wonderful events of Christmas Eve. In truth, what happened seems almost like a fairy tale, and if I hadn't been through it myself, I would scarce believe it. Just imagine, while you and the family sang carols before the fire there in London, I did the same with enemy soldiers here on the battlefields of France. As I wrote before, there has been little serious fighting of late. The first battles of the war left so many dead that both sides have held back until replacements could come from home. So we have mostly stayed in our trenches and waited. But what a terrible waiting it has been, knowing that any moment an artillery shell might land and explode beside us in the trench, killing or maiming several men. And in daylight, not daring to lift our heads above the ground for fear of a sniper's bullet. Through all of this, we couldn't help feeling curious about the German soldiers across the way. After all, they faced the same dangers we did, and slogged about in the same muck. What's more, their first trench was only 50 yards from ours. Between us lay no man's land, bordered on both sides by barbed wire. Yet they were close enough we sometimes heard their voices. Of course, we hated them when they killed our friends, but other times we joked about them, and almost felt we had something in common. And now it seems they felt the same. Just yesterday morning, Christmas Eve day, we had our first good freeze. Cold as we were, we welcomed it, because at least the mud froze solid. Everything was tinged white with frost, while the bright sun shone over all. Perfect Christmas weather. During the day, there was little shelling or rifle fire from either side. As the darkness fell on our Christmas Eve, the shooting stopped entirely. Our first complete silence in months. We hoped it might promise a peaceful holiday, but we didn't count on it. We'd been told the Germans might attack and try to catch us off guard. I went to the dugout to rest, and laying on my cot, I must have drifted asleep. All at once, my friend John was shaking me awake, saying, "Come and see what the Germans are doing." I grabbed my rifle, stumbled out into the trench, and stuck my head cautiously above the sandbags. I never hoped to see a stranger, more lovelier sight. Clusters of tiny lights were shining all along the German line, left and right as far as the eye could see. "What is it?" I asked in bewilderment, and John answered, "Christmas trees." And so it was, the Germans had placed Christmas trees in front of their trenches, lit by candle or lantern like beacons of goodwill. And then we heard their voices raised in song, "Silent Night, Holy Night." The carol may not yet be familiar to us in Britain, but John knew it and he translated it. When the song finished, the men in our trenches applauded. Yes, British soldiers applauding Germans. Then one of our own men started singing, and we all joined in. The first Noel, the angel did say. In truth, we sounded not nearly as good as the Germans, with their fine harmonies, but they responded with enthusiastic applause, and then began another, "O Tannenbaum, O Tannenbaum." Then we replied, "O come, all ye faithful." But this time they joined in, singing the same words in Latin, "Adestus Fidelis." British and Germans harmonizing across no man's land. I would have thought nothing could be more amazing, but what came next was more so. "English, come over," we heard one of them shout. "You no shoot, we no shoot." There in the trenches we looked at each other in bewilderment. Then one of us shouted jokingly, "You come over here." To our astonishment, we saw two figures rise from the trench and climb over their barbed wire and advance unprotected across no man's land. One of them called, "Send officer to talk." I saw one of our men lift his rifle to the ready, and no doubt others did the same, but our captain called out, "Hold your fire." Then he climbed out and went to meet the Germans halfway. We heard them talking, and a few minutes later, the captain came back with a German cigar in his mouth. "We've agreed there will be no shooting before midnight tomorrow," he announced, "but sentries are to remain on duty, and the rest of you, stay alert." Across the way, we could make out groups of 2 or 3 men standing out of the trenches and coming toward us. Then some of us were climbing out too, and in minutes more, there we were in no man's land, over 100 soldiers and officers on each side, shaking hands with men we'd been trying to kill just hours earlier. Before long, a bonfire was built, and all around it we mingled, British khaki and German gray. I must say the Germans were better dressed, with fresh uniforms for the holiday. Only a couple of our men knew German, but more of the Germans knew English. I asked one of them why that was. Because many have worked in England, he said. Before all this, I was a waiter at the Hotel Cecil. Perhaps I waited on your table. Perhaps you did, I said, laughing. He told me he had a girlfriend in London and that the war had interrupted their plans for marriage. I told him, don't worry, we'll have you beat by Easter and then you can come back and marry the girl. He laughed at that. Then he asked if I'd send her a postcard he'd give me later, and I promised I would. Another German had been a porter at Victoria Station. He showed me a picture of his family back in Munich. His eldest sister was so lovely. I said I should like to meet her someday. He beamed and said he would like that very much and gave me his family's address. Even those who could not converse could still exchange gifts. Our cigarettes for their cigars, our tea for their coffee, our corned beef for their sausage. Badges and buttons from uniforms changed owners, and one of our lads walked off with the infamous spiked helmet. I myself traded a jackknife for a leather equipment belt, a fine souvenir to show when I get home. Newspapers, too, changed hands. The Germans howled with laughter at ours. They assured us that France was finished and Russia nearly beaten too. We told them that was nonsense. And one of them said, well, you believe your newspapers and we'll believe ours. Clearly they are lied to. Yet after meeting these men, I wonder how truthful our own newspapers have been. These are not the savage barbarians we've read about so much. They are men with homes and families, hopes and fears, principles, and yes, love of country. In other words, men like ourselves. Why are we led to believe otherwise? As it grew late, a few more songs were traded around the fire, and then all joined in for, I'm not lying to you, Auld Lang Syne. Then we parted with promises to meet again tomorrow, and even some talked of a football match. The Christmas Eve truce didn't last forever. In fact, some generals didn't like it at all and commanded their troops to resume shooting at each other. After all, they were at war. As midnight on Christmas Day approached, men from both sides drifted back to their trenches. Prearranged signals had been decided on to allow the men to get back. The use of a flare was enough to warn men to get back and that the ceasefire was over. Soldiers did eventually resume shooting at each other, but only after a few days of wasting rounds of ammunition shooting at the stars in the sky instead of soldiers in the opposing army across the field. For a few precious hours, there was peace on earth, goodwill toward men, and all because the focus was Christmas. Seems to happen every time, doesn't it? There's something about Christmas that changes people. It's been happening over and over again down through the years of time. Who knows? This week, for you, it may happen once again.